Sometimes the people we judge most harshly are the ones who hold our lives in their hands. Sometimes the quiet passenger you dismiss as too young or not belonging is exactly the person you'll need when everything goes wrong. This is the story of Dr. Amelia Santos, a brilliant young surgeon whose calm professionalism was mistaken for arrogance, whose expertise was dismissed because of her age and appearance. But when a medical crisis erupted at 35,000 feet, everyone on board discovered that first impressions can be deadly wrong. Stay with us for a story about prejudice, power, and the moment when someone's true character is revealed not through words, but through life-saving action. This is a tale that will change how you think about the people around you, and remind you that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? If you love stories of justice, resilience, and unexpected revelations, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the 8th Battery for more incredible tales. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to even more people. Now, let's dive in. The early morning sun cast long golden rays across Terminal 3 at Los Angeles International Airport, illuminating the bustling activity of another day in one of the world's busiest aviation hubs. Gate 47B hummed with the controlled chaos of departure preparations for Skyline Airways Flight 892, a transcontinental red-eye from LAX to John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The Boeing 777-300ER, gleaming white with elegant blue stripes, sat like a sleeping giant at the jet bridge, its cargo holds being loaded with the dreams, anxieties, and expectations of 347 souls preparing for their cross-country journey. Dr. Amelia Santos stood quietly in the priority boarding line, her small frame dwarfed by the business travelers and frequent flyers around her. At 28, she possessed the kind of youthful appearance that often worked against her in professional settings: smooth, unblemished skin that made her look closer to 22, large dark eyes that seemed too trusting for someone who had seen what she had seen, and a petite build that suggested fragility rather than the steel-like resilience that had carried her through medical school, residency, and 2 years as an attending physician in emergency medicine at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Amelia's outfit was carefully chosen for comfort during the 6-hour flight: dark jeans, a soft gray sweater, and comfortable running shoes. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried only a small backpack and a worn leather messenger bag that had accompanied her through medical school. To the casual observer, she looked like any other young professional traveling for business, perhaps a graduate student, maybe a junior employee at a tech company. Nothing about her appearance suggested that her hands had saved dozens of lives, that her mind could diagnose complex medical conditions in seconds, or that she carried more responsibility in a single shift than most people handled in months. The reason for her journey was both professional and personal. Dr. James Morrison, her mentor and the man who had recruited her to Cedars-Sinai, was retiring after 40 years of emergency medicine. The ceremony at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York would honor his contributions to trauma surgery and emergency protocols that had been adopted nationwide. Amelia was not just attending as a colleague, she was being presented with the Morrison Fellowship for Excellence in Emergency Medicine, a prestigious award that would fund her research into rapid trauma response in underserved communities. As she moved through the priority line, Amelia felt the familiar mix of excitement and nervous energy that accompanied any recognition of her work. The fellowship represented validation not just of her skills, but of her choice to specialize in emergency medicine despite the brutal hours, the emotional toll, and the constant pressure of life and death decisions. More importantly, it would allow her to implement her ideas about mobile emergency response units in rural areas where access to trauma care could mean the difference between life and death. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the beginning of first-class boarding. Amelia checked her boarding pass, 1A, a last-minute upgrade that the hospital's travel department had secured. She had initially protested the expense, preferring to fly coach as she always did, but Dr. Morrison had insisted. "You're representing not just yourself, but the entire program," he had said with his characteristic gruff kindness. "Besides, you'll need to be sharp for the presentation. Get some sleep on the plane." As she approached the gate, Amelia's phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother Miguel, a second-year medical student at UCLA. "Kick ass at the ceremony, sis. Dad would be so proud. The message brought a small smile to her face and a familiar tightness to her chest. Their father, a paramedic who had worked the streets of East LA for 25 years, had died in a car accident when Amelia was in her third year of medical school. His death had nearly derailed her studies, but it had also crystallized her understanding of why emergency medicine mattered, because in those crucial moments when everything hung in the balance, competent care wasn't just important, it was everything. The boarding process moved smoothly until Amelia reached the flight attendant checking tickets at the jet bridge entrance. The woman, whose name tag read Janet, appeared to be in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a professional smile that seemed practiced rather than genuine. Janet's eyes swept over Amelia with the kind of quick assessment that frequent flyers learn to recognize, a rapid cataloging of age, attire, and presumed social status. "Boarding pass, please," Janet said, her tone pleasant but perfunctory. Amelia handed over her phone displaying the mobile boarding pass. Janet scanned it, and her eyebrows rose slightly as she read the information on her handheld device. "I'm sorry, miss," Janet said, her voice taking on a tone of professional concern, "but there seems to be an issue with your seat assignment." Amelia frowned. "An issue? I received confirmation of the upgrade yesterday." Janet's smile tightened slightly. "Yes, I can see that. However, our passenger manifest shows a potential problem. Could you step aside for a moment while I verify this with my supervisor?" The request was polite but firm, and Amelia found herself guided to a small area beside the gate counter while other first-class passengers continued to board around her. She watched as businessmen in expensive suits, well-dressed elderly couples, and other travelers who fit the expected demographic of premium passengers moved past her without a second glance. After several minutes, Janet returned with a supervisor, a stern-looking man named Robert whose demeanor suggested years of dealing with difficult situations and demanding passengers. "Miss Santos," Robert began, pronouncing her last name with a slight pause that suggested unfamiliarity, "we have a situation with your booking. It appears there was an error in the upgrade system, and we're going to need to relocate you to your original seat assignment in coach." Amelia's jaw tightened. "I have confirmation of the upgrade. The hospital's travel department coordinated this weeks ago." Robert's expression remained neutral, but there was an undercurrent of impatience in his voice. "I understand your frustration, but our first-class cabin is fully booked with our premium passengers. We have a very nice seat available for you in premium economy, row 15, which offers extra legroom and complimentary beverages." The offer was made as if it were a generous accommodation rather than a clear downgrade from what had been confirmed and paid for. Amelia realized that what was happening had little to do with computer errors and everything to do with assumptions about who belonged in first class and who didn't. "I'd like to speak with the gate supervisor," Amelia said calmly. "There's clearly been a mistake." Janet and Robert exchanged a glance that Amelia caught and interpreted correctly. They had expected her to accept the new seat assignment without argument. "Miss, we're trying to accommodate you here," Janet said, her professional veneer beginning to show stress fractures. "The flight is fully boarded, and we're already behind schedule. We need to resolve this quickly." It was then that a new voice entered the conversation, sharp and authoritative with an undertone of barely contained irritation. "Excuse me, but what exactly is the problem here?" The speaker was a woman in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored business suit with silver hair styled in a way that suggested both elegance and authority. Her name, Amelia would learn later, was Victoria Ashworth, and everything about her, from her posture to her tone to the way the airline staff immediately straightened in her presence, marked her as someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Mrs. Ashworth," Robert said, his voice taking on a deferential quality that hadn't been present when speaking with Amelia. "We're just resolving a small seating issue. Nothing that should delay your flight." Victoria's sharp blue eyes moved from Robert to Janet to Amelia, taking in the situation with the rapid assessment of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms and corporate hierarchies. "I see," Victoria said slowly. "And what exactly is the nature of this seating issue?" Robert cleared his throat. "There was an upgrade error in our system. We're moving this passenger to a more appropriate seat in coach." More appropriate, Victoria repeated, her tone making the words sound like an accusation. And what makes a confirmed first-class seat inappropriate for this particular passenger? The question hung in the air, and Amelia watched as both Robert and Janet struggled to find an answer that wouldn't expose the obvious nature of their assumptions. It's simply a matter of proper passenger placement, Janet finally said, her voice strained. We need to ensure that our premium cabin maintains the appropriate atmosphere for our valued customers. Victoria's smile was razor-sharp. I see. And I assume you've offered appropriate compensation for this bearer? We've offered an upgrade to premium economy, Robert said quickly. That's not an upgrade, that's a downgrade, Victoria replied coldly. This passenger had a confirmed first-class seat, and you're asking her to accept less while keeping her money. In most industries, we call that theft. Amelia felt a surge of gratitude toward this unexpected ally, but also an uncomfortable awareness that the situation was escalating beyond her control. Ma'am, Amelia interjected gently, I appreciate your support, but I can handle this. Victoria turned to look at her directly for the first time, and Amelia saw something shift in the older woman's expression, a recognition, perhaps, or a moment of understanding. I'm sure you can, dear, Victoria said softly. But sometimes it takes someone like me to remind people of their obligations. She turned back to Robert and Janet, her voice returning to its authoritative edge. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to honor this young woman's confirmed seat assignment, or I'm going to need to speak with your station manager about Skyline Airways policies regarding discrimination and false advertising. The threat was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who was accustomed to getting results. Robert's face had gone slightly pale, and Janet was clearly calculating the potential consequences of continued resistance. Mrs. Ashworth, Robert began carefully, I assure you there's no discrimination. Of course there isn't, Victoria interrupted smoothly. Because you're about to resolve this misunderstanding by seating this passenger in her confirmed first-class seat. Aren't you? The question was phrased politely, but everyone present understood it as the ultimatum it was. After a moment of tense silence, Robert nodded reluctantly. Of course. Janet, please escort Miss Santos to her seat. And please apologize for the confusion. Janet's smile was tight enough to crack glass, but she managed a professional nod. Right this way, Miss Santos. And we do apologize for any inconvenience. As they walked down the jet bridge, Amelia felt a mixture of relief and frustration. She was grateful for Victoria's intervention, but troubled by the knowledge that without it, she would likely have been forced to accept the inferior seat assignment. It was a reminder that competence and qualifications meant little when faced with preconceived notions about who belonged where. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 was a study in understated luxury. Wide leather seats that converted to fully flat beds, individual entertainment systems with large screens, and soft ambient lighting that promised comfort for the long journey ahead. Amelia's seat, 1A, was at the very front of the cabin, offering maximum privacy and legroom. As she settled into her seat and stowed her bags, Amelia noticed Victoria taking the seat directly across the aisle in 1B. The older woman caught her eye and offered a small, knowing smile. First time in first class? Victoria asked quietly. Actually, yes, Amelia admitted. The hospital upgraded me for this trip. Hospital? Victoria's eyebrows rose with interest. Are you in healthcare? Amelia hesitated for a moment, remembering countless conversations where her age and appearance had led to assumptions about her level of training and experience. I'm a doctor. Emergency medicine. Victoria's smile widened, and there was genuine warmth in her expression now. A doctor. How wonderful. And here those idiots were trying to shuffle you off to coach because you don't look old enough to afford first class. The blunt assessment was accurate enough to make Amelia laugh despite herself. Something like that. I'm Victoria Ashworth, the older woman said, extending a manicured hand. I sit on the board of several healthcare organizations, so I have tremendous respect for what you do. Just water for me, thank you, Amelia replied, choosing not to engage with the passive-aggressive undertones. "I prefer to stay alert during flights." It was an innocent comment, but it would prove prophetic in ways that no one on board could have anticipated. As dinner service progressed, the first-class cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of overnight travel. Most passengers finished their meals and began preparing for sleep, adjusting their seats to bed mode and settling in with books, tablets, or eye masks. The cabin lights were dimmed to simulate nighttime, and the steady hum of the engines provided a soothing background soundtrack for rest. Amelia found herself unable to sleep despite her comfortable surroundings. Her mind was active with thoughts of the next day's ceremony, her research, and the unexpected encounter at the gate. She pulled out a medical journal and began reading, her small overhead light providing the only illumination in their section of the cabin. Victoria, who seemed to be having similar difficulty sleeping, noticed Amelia's continued alertness. "Nervous about tomorrow?" she asked quietly. "A little," Amelia admitted. "It's a big honor, and there will be some very important people there. I want to make sure I represent my research, and my hospital, well. From what you've told me about your work, I don't think you have anything to worry about," Victoria replied. "Innovation like yours doesn't come along often. You should be proud of what you've accomplished." The encouragement was genuine and meant more to Amelia than Victoria could have known. Recognition from established figures in healthcare was something she still wasn't entirely comfortable accepting, despite her qualifications and achievements. As they talked quietly, neither woman noticed the subtle change in Janet's demeanor as she moved through the cabin checking on passengers. The flight attendant's earlier annoyance seemed to be building into something more pointed, a resentment that was looking for an outlet. It would find one sooner than anyone expected, in a way that would test every assumption that had been made about competence, authority, and who could be trusted when lives hung in the balance. For now, though, Flight 892 continued its smooth journey through the night sky, its passengers unaware that they were sharing their aircraft with someone whose expertise would soon become the most important factor in their collective survival. 3 hours into the flight, as the aircraft cruised steadily through the night sky somewhere over Kansas, most passengers had settled into the deep sleep that comes with overnight travel. The cabin was dark except for scattered reading lights and the soft glow of personal entertainment screens. The air was thick with the quiet breathing of sleeping travelers and the constant hum of engines that had become background noise. Amelia was still awake, having given up on sleep entirely and instead focusing on her laptop screen where she was making final adjustments to her presentation slides. Her medical training had conditioned her to function on minimal sleep, and the excitement about tomorrow's ceremony was providing enough adrenaline to keep her alert. Victoria had finally dozed off about an hour earlier, her seat reclined to a comfortable sleeping position. The first-class cabin was peaceful, with only the occasional soft sound of someone shifting position or the quiet footsteps of cabin crew conducting their periodic safety checks. It was Janet who first noticed something was wrong. She was making her way through the cabin on a routine check when she heard an unusual sound from seat 3C, a seat occupied by Harold Pemberton, a 67-year-old businessman returning from a client meeting in Los Angeles. The sound was a low, labored breathing that immediately caught her attention as different from normal sleep patterns. Janet approached the seat and gently called out, "Mr. Pemberton." "Sir, are you all right?" There was no response. Harold's breathing was becoming increasingly irregular, and even in the dim cabin lighting, Janet could see that his complexion had taken on a grayish pallor that set off immediate alarm bells in her mind. "Mr. Pemberton," she called again, this time more loudly and with growing urgency. She reached out to gently shake his shoulder, and immediately noticed that his skin felt cold and clammy to the touch. Harold's eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused and confused. When he tried to speak, his words came out slurred and barely comprehensible. "I can't, something's wrong." Janet's training kicked in immediately. After 23 years of flying, she had encountered medical emergencies before, and she recognized the signs of a serious situation developing. She pressed the call button for the chief flight attendant and simultaneously reached for the intercom switch. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your chief flight attendant speaking," Marcus Williams' voice came over the cabin speakers, calm but serious. If there is a physician or medical professional on board, please ring your call button immediately. We have a passenger requiring medical assistance. The announcement cut through the quiet of the cabin like a knife. Passengers who had been sleeping began to stir, and those who were awake looked around with the mixture of concern and curiosity that accompanies unexpected disruptions to routine travel. Amelia's head snapped up from her laptop screen the moment she heard the words, medical assistance. Her training had conditioned her to respond to such calls automatically, regardless of the circumstances or her current activities. She immediately pressed her call button and began to gather the medical supplies she always carried in her personal bag, a small but comprehensive emergency kit that included basic diagnostic tools and essential medications. As she moved to unbuckle her seatbelt, she became aware that Victoria had awakened and was watching her with interest. "Is that you?" Victoria asked quietly. "Yes," Amelia replied, her voice already shifting into the focused, professional tone she used in emergency situations. "I need to see what's happening." She stood and began moving toward the source of the commotion, where she could see Janet and Marcus clustered around Harold's seat. As she approached, she noticed that Harold's condition appeared to be deteriorating rapidly, his breathing was becoming more labored, and he seemed to be losing consciousness. "I'm Dr. Santos," Amelia announced as she reached the group. "I'm an emergency medicine physician." "What's the situation?" Marcus looked up with obvious relief. "Dr. Santos, thank you for responding. This is Mr. Pemberton." The flight attendant found him approximately 3 minutes ago experiencing breathing difficulties and altered mental status. Amelia immediately moved into her professional mode, the competent, authoritative physician that her colleagues at Cedars-Sinai knew well, but that was completely different from the quiet young woman who had been sitting in 1A. "Mr. Pemberton, can you hear me?" she said clearly, leaning down to establish eye contact. "I'm Dr. Santos. I'm here to help you." Harold's response was weak and confused, but he seemed to recognize that someone medical was present. Amelia immediately began her assessment, checking his pulse, which was rapid and irregular, and observing his breathing pattern, which showed clear signs of respiratory distress. "I need to examine him properly," Amelia said to Marcus. "Can we get him moved to a more open area where I can work?" It was at this moment that Janet, who had been standing slightly behind Marcus, stepped forward with an expression that Amelia immediately recognized as problematic. "Excuse me," Janet said, her voice carrying a tone of authority that seemed to challenge Amelia's medical credentials. "Are you sure you're qualified to handle this? This man is seriously ill, and we might want to wait for a more experienced physician to respond to the call." The question hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. Marcus looked shocked, Victoria, who had followed Amelia to observe, appeared incredulous, and several other passengers who had gathered to watch the medical emergency turned to stare at Janet with expressions of disbelief. Amelia felt a familiar surge of anger and frustration, but her medical training overrode her personal emotions. Harold's condition was clearly serious, potentially life-threatening, and every moment of delay could be crucial. "I am a board-certified emergency medicine physician," Amelia said firmly, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of handling similar situations under pressure. "I need to examine this patient now." Janet's expression hardened. "I'm sorry, but I need to see some identification. For all we know, you could be anyone claiming to be a doctor. This man's life is at stake." The accusation was so outrageous, so clearly rooted in prejudice rather than legitimate concern, that several passengers audibly gasped. Marcus looked between Janet and Amelia with obvious discomfort, clearly torn between backing his crew member and accepting help from the medical professional who had responded to their call. Victoria stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Are you completely insane? This woman is a doctor who is trying to help a dying man, and you're demanding credentials like she's applying for a job." But Janet was not backing down. The resentment that had been building since the gate incident seemed to have found its outlet, and she was doubling down on her challenge to Amelia's authority. "Mrs. Ashworth, with all due respect, we have protocols for medical emergencies. We can't just let anyone who claims to be a doctor provide medical care. I'm responsible for the safety of everyone on this aircraft. Amelia realized that the situation was spiraling out of control while Harold's condition continued to deteriorate. She could see his breathing becoming more shallow and his skin color worsening. In the emergency room, she would have been working on him for several minutes already, but here she was being forced to argue about her qualifications while a patient potentially died. "Fine," Amelia said sharply, pulling out her wallet and extracting her medical license and hospital ID. "Here's my medical license, my DEA registration, and my hospital identification. I am Dr. Amelia Santos, attending physician in emergency medicine at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Now can I please provide medical care to this patient?" Janet examined the credentials with exaggerated care, as if looking for signs of forgery. The delay was maddening for Amelia, who could see that Harold was showing signs of what appeared to be a cardiac event or possibly a stroke, conditions where every minute of delay significantly increased the risk of permanent damage or death. "These could be fake," Janet said finally, a statement so outrageous that even Marcus looked shocked. "Janet," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a warning tone. "Let the doctor work." But Janet seemed to have committed to her course of action. "I'm sorry, but I have concerns about this person's qualifications. I think we should wait for the captain to make contact with ground medical support before allowing anyone to provide treatment." It was Victoria who finally broke the impasse, her voice carrying the full weight of authority that came from decades of commanding boardrooms and corporate hierarchies. "Young woman," Victoria said to Janet, her tone ice-cold and absolutely commanding, "you are preventing a qualified physician from providing emergency medical care to a dying man. If this patient suffers any harm because of your ignorant interference, I will personally ensure that you face criminal charges for negligent homicide, and I will make it my personal mission to destroy your career and your airline's reputation." The threat was delivered with such absolute certainty and authority that Janet visibly flinched. Victoria continued, her voice growing even more dangerous. "Furthermore, I am Victoria Ashworth, chairman of the board of Mercy General Hospital in Boston, board member of the American Healthcare Association, and donor to 17 major medical institutions across this country. I am personally vouching for Dr. Santos' credentials, and if you continue to interfere with her efforts to save this man's life, you will discover exactly how much influence I have in both the healthcare and aviation industries." The revelation of Victoria's identity and connections hit Janet like a physical blow. The color drained from her face as she realized the magnitude of what she had been doing, not just interfering with medical care, but doing so in front of someone with significant power in the exact industries where such interference could destroy her career. Marcus, meanwhile, had reached his own breaking point. "Janet, step back now. Dr. Santos, please proceed with your examination." Amelia didn't wait for further permission. She immediately knelt beside Harold and began her assessment, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had conducted thousands of similar examinations under pressure. Within moments, her worst fears were confirmed. "He's having a massive myocardial infarction," she announced to the group. "A heart attack. We need to start treatment immediately, and we need to prepare for emergency landing." The word sent a shock wave through the gathered passengers and crew. A heart attack at 37,000 feet, hours from the nearest hospital, was exactly the kind of medical emergency that everyone feared but hoped never to encounter. Amelia was already moving into action, her medical training taking over completely as she began to implement the emergency cardiac protocols that could mean the difference between Harold's life and death. But even as she worked, she was acutely aware that the delay caused by Janet's interference had potentially cost precious minutes, minutes that in cardiac emergencies could determine whether a patient survived with full recovery or suffered permanent damage. The real crisis was just beginning, and everyone on board was about to discover exactly how qualified Dr. Amelia Santos really was. "I need the aircraft medical kit immediately," Amelia commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority that came from years of emergency medicine training. The transformation from the quiet passenger in seat 1A to the commanding physician was so complete that even Janet stepped back involuntarily. Marcus immediately dispatched crew members to retrieve the enhanced medical kit that all international flights carried, while Amelia continued her rapid assessment of Harold's condition. Her hands moved with practiced precision, checking his pulse, blood pressure, and neurological responses while maintaining a calm, reassuring presence for the patient. "Mr. Pemberton, I need you to stay with me," she said clearly, her voice cutting through Harold's growing confusion. "You're having a heart attack, but we're going to take care of you. Can you tell me if you have any chest pain?" Harold's response was weak but audible, "Yes, crushing, can't breathe." "Classic presentation," Amelia murmured, her medical mind cataloging symptoms even as her hands continued their assessment. She could feel the irregular rhythm of his heart, the clamminess of his skin, and see the grayish pallor that indicated poor circulation, all textbook signs of a massive cardiac event. The medical kit arrived within moments, carried by 2 flight attendants who were clearly shaken by the severity of the situation. Amelia opened it quickly, her eyes scanning the contents with the rapid efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. "Excellent," she said with satisfaction. "This is a comprehensive kit. I need aspirin, nitroglycerin, oxygen, and the AED prepared for possible use." As she spoke, she was already pulling out a stethoscope and blood pressure cuff, her movements economical and purposeful. The passengers who had gathered to watch found themselves witnessing a masterclass in emergency medicine as Amelia's training took over completely. "Blood pressure is 180/110, she announced after taking the reading. "Heart rate irregular at approximately 120. Signs of acute coronary syndrome with possible arrhythmia." Victoria, who had positioned herself where she could observe without interfering, was struck by the complete transformation in Amelia's demeanor. The young woman who had been quietly defensive earlier was now a commanding presence, radiating competence and authority in a way that made it impossible to question her qualifications. Janet, meanwhile, stood frozen nearby, clearly realizing the magnitude of her earlier interference. The delay she had caused while demanding credentials could have been fatal, and everyone present was becoming aware of that fact. "Mr. Pemberton," Amelia said, positioning herself so Harold could see her face clearly, "I'm going to give you some medication to help with the chest pain. I need you to put this nitroglycerin tablet under your tongue and let it dissolve." She administered the medication with careful precision, monitoring Harold's response while simultaneously preparing additional treatments. Her hands moved between checking his pulse, adjusting the oxygen mask that Marcus had provided, and preparing emergency medications. "Captain," Amelia called out, knowing that Marcus would relay the message to the cockpit, "we need to declare a medical emergency and request priority landing at the nearest airport with cardiac facilities. This patient needs a cardiac catheterization lab as soon as possible." The message was relayed immediately, and within moments, Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom, calm but serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a medical emergency that requires us to divert to Denver International Airport. We will be beginning our descent shortly. Please return to your seats and follow all crew instructions." As the aircraft began to change course, Amelia continued her intensive care of Harold. She administered aspirin to help prevent further clot formation, monitored his cardiac rhythm using the portable EKG function in the medical kit, and maintained a steady stream of reassuring communication with her patient. "The nitroglycerin is helping," she observed with satisfaction as Harold's breathing became slightly less labored. "Mr. Pemberton, can you tell me about your medical history? Any previous heart problems?" "Had bypass surgery 5 years ago," Harold managed to say between labored breaths. "Taking medications." "What medications?" Amelia asked, her mind already processing the implications of previous cardiac surgery. Harold's wife, who had been summoned from her seat in economy, arrived with his medication list. Amelia reviewed it quickly, noting the blood thinners, beta blockers, and cholesterol medications that indicated a patient with significant cardiac risk factors. "This is very helpful," Amelia told Harold's wife gently. "Your husband is getting the best possible care. We're going to get him to a hospital where they can open the blocked artery and restore blood flow to his heart." As she worked, Amelia became aware that word had spread throughout the aircraft about what was happening. Passengers were straining to see the medical emergency in progress, and many were recording with their phones, a modern reality that she had learned to ignore during her hospital work. What she couldn't ignore was the growing murmur of conversation as passengers began to piece together what had happened earlier. The story of Janet's interference with the medical response was spreading through the cabin, creating a buzz of anger and disbelief. "Can you believe that flight attendant tried to stop her from helping?" she heard one passenger whisper. "She demanded to see credentials while that man was dying," another added incredulously. "What if the doctor hadn't been so persistent? He could have died because of that woman's prejudice." Victoria, who was positioned where she could hear these conversations, felt her own anger building. As someone who had spent decades fighting workplace discrimination, she recognized Janet's behavior as a particularly dangerous form of bias, the kind that could literally cost lives. Meanwhile, Amelia continued her intensive monitoring of Harold's condition. She had managed to stabilize him somewhat, but she knew that time was still critical. Heart attacks were unpredictable, and even with the best pre-hospital care, the patient needed definitive treatment in a cardiac catheterization lab. "How much longer to Denver?" she asked Marcus. "Approximately 25 minutes, he replied. "Ground medical is standing by, and we'll have paramedics and a cardiac team waiting." "Good," Amelia said, checking Harold's pulse again. "His rhythm is stabilizing, but we need to watch for complications. I want to keep him on high-flow oxygen and continue cardiac monitoring." As she spoke, she was already preparing for the next phase of care, the handoff to ground-based emergency medical services. Her experience in emergency medicine had taught her that transitions between care providers were often the most dangerous moments for patients, and she was already planning how to communicate Harold's condition and treatment to the receiving medical team. It was during this intense focus on patient care that Janet made her next serious error in judgment. Perhaps driven by embarrassment over her earlier interference, or possibly by a stubborn refusal to acknowledge her mistake, Janet approached the group again with an expression that suggested she was still questioning Amelia's medical management. "Excuse me, doctor," Janet said, emphasizing the title in a way that made it sound like a challenge, "but don't you think you might be overdoing the treatment? Maybe we should wait for the paramedics to take over when we land." The suggestion was so medically inappropriate, so clearly driven by personal animosity rather than patient care concerns, that several passengers audibly gasped. Victoria's face went white with fury, and Marcus looked like he wanted to physically remove Janet from the area. But it was Amelia's response that truly demonstrated the depth of her professionalism and the steel beneath her calm exterior. She looked up from Harold's bedside, her eyes locking onto Janet's with an intensity that made the flight attendant take an involuntary step backward. "Ma'am," Amelia said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority, "you have already delayed this patient's care by several critical minutes with your inappropriate interference. Your continued questioning of medical decisions that you are not qualified to evaluate is now actively endangering this patient's life." She paused, letting the words sink in before continuing with devastating calm. "If you interfere with this patient's care one more time, I will have you criminally charged with practicing medicine without a license and interfering with emergency medical treatment. I suggest you step back and allow the qualified medical professional, that would be me, to do her job." The rebuke was delivered with such clinical precision and authority that Janet visibly wilted. The other passengers looked on with a mixture of shock and approval as the young doctor they had seen bullied and questioned earlier revealed the full extent of her competence and professional backbone. Victoria smiled grimly, recognizing the moment when someone finally stood up to institutional prejudice with the full force of their expertise and authority. Harold, despite his medical crisis, seemed to register the exchange and managed a weak smile. "Good, doctor," he whispered to Amelia. "Thank you." "Just doing my job, Mr. Pemberton," Amelia replied gently, her focus immediately returning to his care. "And my job is to get you safely to the hospital." As the aircraft continued its descent toward Denver, the medical crisis was stabilizing, but the social dynamics on board had shifted dramatically. The passenger who had been questioned and diminished earlier was now clearly the most important person on the aircraft, and everyone present was witnessing what happened when expertise met prejudice, and won. But the real reckoning was still to come. The descent into Denver International Airport was conducted with the precision that only comes from years of training and the urgency that accompanies a true medical emergency. Captain Rodriguez had been in contact with Denver Approach Control and Emergency Medical Services, coordinating a priority landing that would place Harold directly into the hands of one of the region's premier cardiac care teams. As the aircraft touched down and taxied quickly to the designated gate, Amelia maintained her vigilant monitoring of Harold's condition. The nitroglycerin and aspirin had helped stabilize his immediate symptoms, but she knew that the next few hours would be critical for his long-term survival and recovery. Cardiac rhythm is holding steady, she reported to Marcus, who was coordinating with ground services. Blood pressure has improved to 160/95. He's stable for transport, but time is still critical. Through the aircraft windows, passengers could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles positioned near the gate, paramedics, fire department personnel, and what appeared to be a specialized cardiac response team, all standing by for Harold's immediate transfer to Presbyterian/St. Joseph Hospital's renowned cardiac center. As the jet bridge connected and the aircraft door opened, a team of paramedics boarded immediately, led by a senior paramedic whose confident demeanor suggested extensive experience with cardiac emergencies. Behind them came Dr. Patricia Williams, an emergency medicine physician from Presbyterian/St. Joseph who served as the airport's medical response coordinator. "I'm Dr. Williams," she announced as she approached the group. "We're here to take over care for your cardiac patient." Amelia looked up from Harold's side, where she had been maintaining continuous monitoring. "Dr. Amelia Santos, Emergency Medicine, Cedars-Sinai. I'm ready to give you a full report." Dr. Williams paused, taking in Amelia's youthful appearance with a moment of surprise, but her professionalism quickly overrode any initial assumptions. "Dr. Santos, please proceed with your report." Harold Pemberton, 67-year-old male with history of coronary artery bypass surgery 5 years ago, presented with acute onset chest pain, diaphoresis, and altered mental status approximately 45 minutes ago, Amelia began, delivering the kind of precise, comprehensive handoff that she had perfected during her residency. As she spoke, Dr. Williams' expression shifted from polite attention to genuine respect. Amelia's report was flawless, comprehensive, clinically relevant, and delivered with the efficiency that marked an experienced emergency physician. Current medications include metoprolol, atorvastatin, clopidogrel, and lisinopril, Amelia continued. "I administered sublingual nitroglycerin, 325 mg of aspirin, and high-flow oxygen. Initial blood pressure was 180/110, currently 160/95. Heart rate irregular between 110 and 120, with occasional PVCs noted on portable EKG." Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. "Excellent pre-hospital care, Dr. Santos. Your interventions likely prevented a much worse outcome." As the paramedics carefully transferred Harold to their stretcher and began preparing him for transport, Dr. Williams pulled Amelia aside. "I have to ask," she said quietly, "are you the Dr. Santos who published the research on rapid cardiac response protocols in rural settings? The work that was featured in the Journal of Emergency Medicine last year?" Amelia nodded, somewhat surprised to be recognized. "Yes, that was my research." Dr. Williams' face lit up with genuine excitement. "That was groundbreaking work. We've actually implemented some of your protocols here in our rural outreach program. It's an honor to meet you." The exchange was overheard by several passengers, including Victoria, who felt a surge of vindication for her earlier defense of Amelia's credentials. Here was independent confirmation from another emergency physician that Amelia was not just qualified, but actually distinguished in her field. Harold, now stable on the paramedic's stretcher and preparing for transport, reached out to grasp Amelia's hand. "Doctor," he said weakly but clearly, "you saved my life. If that flight attendant had had her way." He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone present understood the implication. Janet's interference could easily have delayed treatment long enough to result in a fatal outcome. "Just focus on your recovery, Mr. Pemberton," Amelia said gently. "You're in excellent hands now." As Harold was wheeled off the aircraft, Dr. Williams turned back to Amelia. "Dr. Santos, I hope you'll consider visiting our department sometime. We'd love to hear more about your mobile response unit research." "I'd be honored," Amelia replied. "Actually, I'm heading to New York for a presentation on that exact topic." Dr. Williams smiled. "The Morrison Fellowship ceremony? I heard about that. Congratulations, that's an incredible honor." As the medical team departed with Harold, the aircraft cabin began to buzz with conversation as passengers processed what they had witnessed. The story was already spreading beyond the immediate witnesses, with passengers calling and texting friends and family about the dramatic medical emergency and the shocking interference they had observed. It was then that Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. He had been briefed on the medical emergency and the circumstances surrounding the delayed response, and he was clearly not pleased with what he had learned. "Dr. Santos," he said, approaching Amelia with obvious respect, "I want to personally thank you for your exceptional care of our passenger. I've been flying for 20 years, and I've rarely seen such professional medical management under difficult circumstances." He paused, his expression darkening as he turned toward Janet, who had been standing silently in the background since her last confrontation with Amelia. "I also want to apologize for the inexcusable interference you experienced from a member of my crew. Such behavior is not representative of Skyline Airways' values or training." Janet's face went pale as she realized that the captain was publicly addressing her misconduct in front of the passengers. Captain Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, "Flight Attendant Miller, you will report to my office immediately upon our arrival in New York. Your actions tonight endangered a passenger's life and violated every principle of emergency response that we train for." The public reprimand sent a shock wave through the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed Janet's behavior looked on with satisfaction as accountability finally arrived. Victoria, meanwhile, had been quietly making phone calls during the medical emergency's resolution. As someone with significant influence in both healthcare and corporate circles, she had contacts throughout the aviation industry, and she was ensuring that the evening's events would be properly documented and addressed. "Dr. Santos," Victoria said, approaching as the crowd began to disperse, "I've taken the liberty of contacting the Media Relations Department at Skyline Airways. They'll want to acknowledge your heroic efforts tonight." Amelia looked uncomfortable with the attention. "That's really not necessary. I was just doing what any physician would do." "No," Victoria said firmly, "you were doing what a highly skilled emergency physician would do, despite facing discrimination and interference that could have cost a man his life. That needs to be recognized." As passengers began to reboard for the continuation of their flight to New York, the atmosphere in the cabin had changed completely. Amelia was no longer the young woman whose qualifications had been questioned, she was the hero who had saved a life under pressure, demonstrating grace under fire and expertise that commanded universal respect. Janet, meanwhile, faced the remainder of the flight knowing that her career with Skyline Airways was effectively over. Her prejudice and poor judgment had been exposed in the most public and consequential way possible, witnessed by dozens of passengers and recorded on multiple phones. As Flight 892 prepared for takeoff for the final leg to New York, Amelia found herself reflecting on the extraordinary events of the evening. She had boarded the aircraft as just another passenger, had her credentials questioned and her competence challenged, and had ultimately proven her worth in the most dramatic way possible. But more importantly, Harold Pemberton was alive and receiving the cardiac care he needed, and that, regardless of the personal vindication, was what truly mattered. The flight would continue to New York, but the real story was just beginning to unfold. The remaining portion of Flight 892 to New York passed in an atmosphere of quiet reflection and growing awareness among passengers of what they had witnessed. Word of the medical emergency and Janet's interference had spread throughout the entire aircraft, carried by passengers who had observed the events and crew members who were struggling to process their colleagues' shocking behavior. Amelia found herself receiving a steady stream of visitors to her first-class seat, passengers who wanted to thank her for her heroic efforts, medical professionals who introduced themselves and expressed admiration for her skill under pressure, and even crew members who quietly apologized for Janet's conduct. Dr. Santos, said Maria, one of the senior flight attendants who had been working in the economy cabin during the emergency, I want you to know that Janet's behavior does not represent how Skyline Airways trains us to respond to medical emergencies. What she did was not just unprofessional, it was dangerous. The sentiment was echoed by Marcus, who stopped by Amelia's seat during a quiet moment in the flight. Doctor, I've been flying for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened tonight, he said quietly. Your medical care was exceptional, but more than that, your professionalism in the face of that interference was remarkable. I'm deeply sorry for what you experienced. Victoria, meanwhile, had spent much of the flight on her phone, despite the late hour. As chairman of the board at Mercy General Hospital and a well-connected figure in healthcare circles, she had contacts throughout the medical and aviation industries, and she was ensuring that the night's events received proper attention. I've spoken with the medical director at Presbyterian/St. Joseph, she informed Amelia during one of these conversations. Harold is in surgery now, emergency cardiac catheterization. The cardiologist said that your pre-hospital care likely prevented massive tissue death. Without your intervention, he probably wouldn't have survived the flight. The news brought Amelia a deep sense of satisfaction, but also reinforced her anger about the delay that Janet's interference had caused. In cardiac emergencies, every minute mattered, and the several minutes lost to credential challenges could have easily meant the difference between life and death. As the aircraft began its descent into JFK, Captain Rodriguez made an unusual announcement over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Before we land, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something extraordinary that happened during our flight tonight. When one of our passengers experienced a life-threatening medical emergency, Dr. Amelia Santos responded with exceptional skill and professionalism, providing emergency cardiac care that likely saved his life. The captain's words were met with spontaneous applause throughout the cabin, a rare occurrence that reflected the passengers' genuine appreciation for what they had witnessed. Dr. Santos exemplifies the best of the medical profession, Captain Rodriguez continued, and her actions tonight remind us all of the importance of treating every individual with respect and recognizing expertise wherever we find it. The pointed reference to respect and recognition was clearly directed at Janet's behavior, and passengers throughout the cabin understood the subtext immediately. As the aircraft touched down at JFK and taxied to the gate, Amelia found herself feeling a complex mixture of emotions. The medical emergency had been successfully managed, and Harold was receiving the care he needed, but the events of the evening had also exposed ugly realities about prejudice and discrimination that she faced regularly in her professional life. Dr. Santos, Victoria said as they prepared to disembark, I want you to know that this incident will not be forgotten. I have connections throughout the aviation industry, and I'm going to ensure that Skyline Airways takes meaningful action to address what happened tonight. Victoria's words proved prophetic. Within hours of the flight's arrival, the story had spread throughout social media, driven by passenger accounts and videos that captured portions of the medical emergency and Janet's interference. The hashtag Dr. Santos began trending, along with accounts of her heroic medical intervention and the shocking discrimination she faced. The story was picked up by major news outlets within 24 hours, framed as a powerful example of both medical heroism and workplace discrimination. Skyline Airways found itself facing intense public scrutiny, with thousands of social media users calling for accountability and policy changes. More importantly for Amelia personally, the incident had attracted attention from the medical community as well. By the time she arrived at the Morrison Fellowship ceremony the following evening, her actions on Flight 892 had become legendary among emergency medicine physicians. Dr. Santos, said Dr. James Morrison himself as she approached the podium to accept her fellowship award, your research on mobile emergency response has already established you as a leader in our field. But your actions last night demonstrated something even more important, the kind of grace under pressure and commitment to patient care that defines the very best of our profession. The standing ovation that followed was not just for her research accomplishments, but for her embodiment of the values that emergency medicine represented, competence, courage, and an unwavering commitment to patient care regardless of circumstances. In her acceptance speech, Amelia chose to address the events directly. Last night reminded me why our work matters, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. When someone's life hangs in the balance, credentials on a wall mean nothing. What matters is knowledge, skill, and the determination to do what's right despite any obstacles we might face. She paused, looking out at an audience that included some of the most distinguished emergency physicians in the country. But last night also reminded me that we still have work to do as a profession and as a society. When bias and prejudice interfere with medical care, when assumptions about competence are based on appearance rather than training, we put lives at risk. We cannot allow that to happen. The speech was met with thunderous applause and would later be cited as a defining moment in discussions about discrimination in healthcare settings. The fallout from Flight 892 was swift and comprehensive. Skyline Airways, facing intense public pressure and potential legal liability, launched an immediate internal investigation into Janet's conduct and the circumstances that had allowed such behavior to occur. Janet Miller was terminated within 48 hours of the flight's arrival, with the airline citing gross violation of emergency response protocols and passenger safety procedures. The termination was accompanied by a public statement acknowledging the severity of her interference with medical care. But Victoria Ashworth had made it clear that individual accountability was not sufficient. Using her influence and connections, she demanded systemic changes that would prevent similar incidents in the future. This was not an isolated incident, Victoria stated in a letter to Skyline Airways' board of directors that was simultaneously released to the media. This was a symptom of institutional attitudes that value appearances over competence and assumptions over qualifications. The solution requires comprehensive policy reform, not just individual discipline. Within 2 weeks, Skyline Airways announced a complete overhaul of their medical emergency response training, developed in consultation with leading emergency medicine physicians and anti-discrimination experts. The new protocols emphasized recognition of medical credentials regardless of the physician's age, appearance, or demographic characteristics, and included specific disciplinary measures for crew members who interfered with legitimate medical care. More significantly, Skyline Airways established the Santos Emergency Medicine Fund, a $2 million initiative to support research into improving in-flight medical care and emergency response protocols. The fund was named in Amelia's honor, despite her initial protests about the attention. Dr. Santos' actions on Flight 892 exemplify the highest standards of medical care and professional excellence, said Robert Chin, Skyline Airways CEO, in announcing the fund. This initiative will ensure that her commitment to emergency medicine continues to benefit patients for years to come. Harold Pemberton made a full recovery from his heart attack, thanks in large part to the rapid intervention he received from Amelia. He became one of the most vocal advocates for the changes that Skyline Airways implemented, speaking publicly about how discrimination nearly cost him his life. If that young doctor hadn't been persistent, if she had accepted the flight attendant's prejudice and stepped back, I would be dead, Harold said in an interview with CNN. My grandchildren would have grown up without their grandfather because someone decided that a young Latina woman couldn't possibly be qualified to save my life. His words resonated powerfully with audiences across the country and added weight to calls for broader changes in how medical emergencies were handled in aviation settings. The incident also had broader implications for the medical profession itself. Medical schools began using the Flight 892 case study in their curricula, discussing both the clinical aspects of in-flight emergency care and the social dynamics that could interfere with optimal medical treatment. The Santos case demonstrates why cultural competency and anti-bias training are essential components of medical education, said Dr. Patricia Williams, the Denver emergency physician who had taken over Harold's care. We cannot allow prejudice to compromise patient care, whether it's in a hospital, an aircraft, or any other setting where medical decisions are made. 6 months after Flight 892, the changes initiated by the incident had rippled throughout the aviation industry and beyond. Amelia Santos had become an inadvertent spokesperson for the intersection of healthcare competence and social justice, using her platform to advocate for policies that would prevent discrimination from interfering with patient care. The Morrison Fellowship had provided her with resources to expand her mobile emergency response research, and she had incorporated lessons learned from the in-flight medical emergency into her protocols for remote care situations. Her work was attracting international attention, with healthcare systems in several countries requesting consultation on implementing similar programs. The Flight 892 incident taught me that expertise means nothing if we don't have the courage to insist on using it, Amelia reflected during a presentation at the International Conference on Emergency Medicine. But it also showed me that one moment of clear action can change not just one life, but entire systems. Victoria Ashworth had become a close mentor and advocate, using her influence to open doors for Amelia's research and to promote broader discussions about discrimination in healthcare settings. Their unlikely friendship, forged in the crucible of crisis, had become a powerful force for change in both the medical and corporate worlds. Amelia represents the future of medicine, Victoria often said in her speeches about healthcare leadership. She combines clinical excellence with social awareness, and she has the courage to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. Janet Miller, meanwhile, had struggled to find employment in the aviation industry after her termination. The incident had become a cautionary tale used in flight attendant training programs across multiple airlines, serving as an example of how personal bias could compromise both professional responsibilities and passenger safety. Harold Pemberton had made a complete recovery and had become a passionate advocate for emergency medicine research. He established an annual scholarship at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center for students pursuing emergency medicine, with preference given to those from underrepresented backgrounds. Dr. Santos saved my life, Harold said at the scholarship's inaugural presentation, but she also saved something more important. She preserved the principle that competence and caring matter more than appearances or assumptions. The broader aviation industry had implemented changes inspired by the Skyline Airways reforms, with multiple airlines revising their medical emergency protocols to ensure that qualified medical professionals could provide care without discrimination or unnecessary barriers. The story of Flight 892 became required reading in business schools as well, studied as a case example of how individual prejudice could create corporate liability and how companies needed to address systemic bias in their policies and training programs. As Amelia looked back on the events of that night 6 months later, she reflected on how a routine flight had become a turning point not just in her own career, but in broader conversations about competence, discrimination, and the courage required to stand up for what's right. "I boarded that plane as just another passenger," she said during her keynote speech at the annual Emergency Medicine Conference. "I was questioned, dismissed, and nearly prevented from providing care that saved a life. But I also discovered that when you know you're right, when you have the skills and knowledge to help someone, you have an obligation to persist despite any obstacles." She paused, looking out at an audience of several hundred emergency physicians from around the world. The real lesson of Flight 892 isn't about one night or one medical emergency. It's about recognizing that excellence comes in many forms, that competence doesn't always look like what we expect, and that our assumptions about who belongs where can literally be matters of life and death. The applause that followed was not just appreciation for her words, but recognition of a fundamental truth that extended far beyond medicine or aviation, that in a world where bias and prejudice still shaped interactions and decisions, it required courage and persistence to ensure that expertise and merit prevailed over assumptions and stereotypes. Dr. Amelia Santos had learned that lesson at 37,000 feet, in a crisis that tested not just her medical skills but her character. In rising to meet that test, she had not only saved a life but had also helped change a system, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is simply refusing to accept it and insisting on doing what's right. The flight had landed safely, the patient had survived, and the system had changed. But most importantly, a young doctor had demonstrated that quiet competence, when backed by unwavering determination, could overcome any obstacle and save any life, including, perhaps, the moral life of an industry that had learned to see beyond its assumptions and recognize excellence wherever it might be found. That if this story resonated with you, think about the assumptions you make about the people around you. Have you ever witnessed someone's competence being questioned because of their age, appearance, or background? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if Dr. Santos' courage inspired you, and subscribe to the 8th Battery for more tales of resilience, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Your support helps us continue sharing these meaningful stories. What did you think of Amelia's response to discrimination? Should she have been more forceful earlier, or was her patient persistence the right approach? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next story.